All right, good afternoon. I want to start out with just a brief introduction here so we can get oriented. My name is Don Freese, and I'm with the Federal Bureau of Investigation here today in my role as the Director of the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force. And I'm here with my partner, Eric Goldstein, from the Department of Homeland Security, and Eric and I will take you just on a wild ride this afternoon after lunch through looking at intrusion activities, and really just want to talk about some goals in advance of what we're trying to do and what we're trying to communicate here. But really the first thing is, and what I'll spend just a little brief time on in the early part of the presentation, is to set a baseline understanding of the adversary or the threat that no matter what sector you come from, no matter private or government background, no matter what networks that you're working in either protection or just information technology, or as attorneys advising any of those folks, that we'll talk about the adversaries that you're going to face. And we want to do that before we get into the actual indicator sharing portion of things that Eric's going to really dwell on, so that we can all just have a common understanding and just agree in general, I'll say, about those adversaries, who they are and what they do. Eric's goal is going to be to help you to understand a specific part of legislation that really works through the interagency or the whole of government process, and that's really what Eric and I represent to you today by demonstrating and talking a little bit about how we work every day in the government environment in order to support investigative activities, intelligence activities, and the sharing of the results of both the same. And that's where this AIS, or Automated Indicator Sharing process, really comes from. Eric will explain that to you a little bit, and then we'll both take questions. And that really is a goal as well. First, to set that baseline, to educate you about AIS and what its goals are in its beta form right now, what it can do for you, and lastly, to take questions and interact with each of you. And the room, we're adjusting as speakers to a room that is sort of lateral instead of straight out, so I'll try to make eye contact with as many folks as I can as we go through this. But with that said, we're going to just start out with this first slide here, and hopefully everyone can see these on the screens around the room. And everything that we'll talk about, oftentimes today, Eric and I will switch over with terms, but we may use terms like left to right. So generally, for the room's understanding today, when we're talking about on the left side of things, we're talking about earlier pre-attack phases of things. So it's just like you would read anything else, but if we talk about something that's left of exploit, that's what we're talking about on the left. And that's the way these two first slides will read as well. So on the left, we see the lowest common denominator in adversary, and we're going to wrap that into what we term the hacktivist culture, or those threats who are hacktivism driven. One thing I want to note about hacktivism, at a baseline for anyone who's in a legal profession, this is going to be a concern. It's going to become a risk assessment that you have to do depending on your client base, no matter what sector. We use colors here, left and right as well, so left being the least intrusive, lowest impact, all the way to the right, where we talk about the warfare, nation-state adversary type aspects, generally to destructive malware and other impacts on networks, but those networks, or those activities, computer network activities, operations, and attacks that are designed to forward another nation's agenda through cyber vectors. A couple of these things are important to understand in that they do slip from one to another. Sometimes hacktivists are recruited by some of the middle grounds that you see in the espionage world. Sometimes espionage is purely economic focused, so we investigate both economic espionage as well as nation-state sponsors, so state secrets, or those trying to steal military technologies and things like that. So I just want to make it clear that there's nuance with all these different areas, but these are the core adversaries that we look at. One thing that I want to note and point out in this first slide that's notably absent is any machine or any type of artificial intelligence. We don't see that as an adversary right now. Conceptually, in some groups, folks feel that the internet or some adversary activity is just sort of self-generated through different technology and mechanisms. That's not the case. On both ends of the spectrum, on both the attack and the defending side, we're always dealing with a human element. And no matter what, that's always our goal, is to work against that activity and to eliminate and disrupt the attacks before they happen. With the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI, both of our efforts are always focused on prevention rather than response. However, oftentimes we're involved in response together and working through investigations to attribute what activity occurred and to mitigate afterwards. So if you keep that in mind, those are the folks that we're talking about there on that left to right spectrum. And the next slide, just a very basic one. This is essentially what happens during an intrusion. When we talk about an intrusion event, or some of those other terms that we may throw out just because we speak in certain ways, if we say CNA, computer network attack, CNO is a computer network operation designed to take information or something like that. But if you look at this on baseline on the left, we have the reconnaissance phase. And when we talk about what we do in the government, our sole focus is to get into and to provide information to network defenders to be able to identify activities by the adversary in that early reconnaissance phase. Okay, because that's the most preventative space we can be in. So when your systems oftentimes are being scanned, that's a term that we'll use. Scan means simply the adversary trying to reconnoiter your systems and where some soft spots may be. If you can catch that, or if you have someone who's telling you in an IT or security position that they're seeing things in a reconnaissance phase, that's good news. All right, as we move to the right, once someone's established a foothold and you start to see those colors change a bit, all the way to escalation of privileges, that's still a good time to catch things before impact has hit. So whatever risk assessment framework that you're working in, it's important to understand that this is a continuum of activity. You see that little bit of a whirl loop there, a roller coaster upside down, and it's that loop there where the adversary will gain more and more access, escalate privileges further, and expand throughout the network. Okay, that's generally still pre-effect, so we want to make sure that we're catching things before an effect. And what I'm trying to establish here is everything that Eric's talking about as we share different signatures, indicators, things like that, they're all to drive all of our behaviors as far left as possible. And the goal is to reduce and eventually put myself and my staff out of business. We should be working, making candlesticks and shoes, fine timepieces perhaps, but doing cyber defense for a whole life makes people a little strange. As you can see, just by looking at me up here, I wear glasses all the time now from staring at the screens too long, so a lot of sacrifices made for our country. All right, we're trying to get a little levity injected here, but really this is a very common behavior that everybody deals with. It's not something that's overly difficult to work through, and that's what we want to set that baseline. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Eric, and let Eric speak, and I'll join in as necessary. Over to you, sir.
Great. Thank you, Don, and thank you all for being here today. Looking forward to speaking with you. I want to start by kind of really building off of 2 points that Don made. The first of which is that adversary activity on the networks of all organizations now is ubiquitous. Whether federal agency, a private company, a nonprofit, our foreign partners, our adversaries are trying to break in constantly 24/7. And our goal as a cybersecurity community is to figure out how do we identify that adversary activity at that reconnaissance phase, or at the very least at that initial attack phase, and stop it before it proceeds along the attack path that Don just described. Now to do that, we have to do a few things. We need the right tools in place, we need trained personnel, but perhaps most importantly, we need information. We need to know what is the adversary doing, what does it look like, and how can we use that information, ideally in our automated cybersecurity tools, to detect the activity and stop it before it causes damage. That is what the US government is trying to do with our automated indicator sharing platform. Now, the panel before lunch, you had a fantastic deep dive into how the Cybersecurity Act of 2015 set up a legal and policy infrastructure through which companies, federal entities, non-federal entities, can share and exchange cyber threat indicators and defensive measures with each other and with the federal government through DHS. I'm going to walk through in a bit more granularity, how does this actually work? What are we actually doing? What are we actually trying to do? I should note as a broad caveat to start that this briefing is described as a demo in the agenda. A demo might be somewhat hyperbolic. The system is real time, and so if it were a real time demo, we'd all be out of here very quickly. So we are doing some graphical representations of what this system is trying to do. But it's useful to step back for a moment and actually talk a little bit more about what do we mean when we say cyber threat indicator. And Gabe Turan from DHS earlier gave you a few examples of kind of what a cyber threat indicator might be. And really, conceptually, a cyber threat indicator is information that network defenders can use to identify, detect, and block adversary activity attempting to compromise your networks or your clients' networks. And so on the screen, we have a few examples, an IP address, perhaps, of a computer trying to probe a network or take data away, a hash of software that's coming in on a spear phishing email that might be a virus, other bad software, an email header with from information, origin computer information that can be used to block the email. There are actually 340 different fields, and we'll talk more about fields in a moment, but 340 categories that could compromise a cyber threat indicator. And so an IP address, in and of itself, is not a cyber threat indicator. It is an attribute of a cyber threat indicator. And so there are 340 of these different attributes that collectively comprise a cyber threat indicator. And importantly, it's these attributes that allow network defenders to have the granularity and understanding of the specific cybersecurity threat to actually effectively detect it and block it. Now, I think a useful conceptual analogy when thinking through a cyber threat indicator is the idea of a paper form. So every year at tax time, we all either receive or fill out a W-2. And on that W-2, there is some measure of information that we have, our names, our address, and then there are fields that we don't have. Either it doesn't apply to us, we don't have the information, and this is similar to a cyber threat indicator. Now, I mentioned that there are 340 of these fields. And when a network defender identifies an attempted compromise of their network, they may have information to populate 338 of those fields, or they may have information to populate only 2. But when thinking about sharing a cyber threat indicator, either among non-federal partners or with the federal government through DHS, it's important to think of indicators in these fields, which collectively describe what an adversary is doing. It might describe the computer they're coming at you from. It might describe what the software they're using looks like. It might describe how confident you are as the submitting entity that the indicator is actually indicative of bad activity. Now, the prior panel spoke in great depth about the privacy scrubs that are conducted by the submitting entity and by DHS. And so I certainly won't belabor that point too much here. But as we think through this W-2 analogy, it's notable that the vast majority of fields, or the vast majority of boxes on this form, are passed through automatically with only an automated computer screen. And there's a very small subset of fields, either fields where the computer for some reason recognizes that that field doesn't correspond to what a cyber threat indicator should look like. An example of that is we know that emails should be text, @ and then text.com.net.edu. If an email address doesn't look like that, the computer will say, that doesn't seem right. I'm going to kick that back. A second example of a cyber threat indicator field that might be reviewed is a free text field, where the computer cannot independently validate that the data in that field is not personal information not related to a cybersecurity threat. And so there is some small subset of these fields that will not be passed through automatically, but the goal is that the vast majority of these 300x fields will be passed through automatically from the submitting entity through DHS to all of our partners in automated indicator sharing. Now, this diagram is vaguely reminiscent of MC Escher, I think, but we're going to try and use it as a symbolism of what we're trying to do with this system. And I'd focus in the first instance on this big yellow taxi sign, and we can blow up on it here. Taxi is the rails of automated indicator sharing. It is the format through which participants in automated indicator sharing share information in real time with DHS, and the mechanism through which DHS shares that information back out to federal partners and non-federal partners also in real time. It's really the heartbeat of automated indicator sharing. And so this graphic on the screen is really a representation of how this system works. There is what is called a taxi server, which is really just a computer sitting at DHS that ingests cyber threat indicators from all kinds of sources, from commercial feeds that DHS purchases, from open source feeds, from vendors, from non-federal entities, from the federal government. These all go into this taxi server, which is really akin to just a giant mixing bowl. And each participant in automated indicator sharing, private companies, federal agencies, foreign allies, also have their own client of the taxi server. And so to use an example, when the FBI, when an energy company, when a nonprofit, when a foreign ally identifies a cybersecurity compromise, say in their firewall, they say, this really seems like bad activity. I've seen this before. They may use their automated tools, for example, in their firewall, to pull out that cyber threat indicator, format it in STIX, which is the international standard that's used as the basis for automated indicator sharing, and then share that through their taxi client in real time with this DHS taxi server. And the goal here again is to get as many indicators as possible shared as quickly and widely as possible. Because if we think about this conceptually, if I am the adversary and I'm attempting to compromise an energy company, I'm not going to just target that one company. I'm probably going to launch a campaign. I'm going to attempt to compromise 100 energy companies. Maybe I'm going to target the energy company's supply chain, the manufacturing plant from whom they purchase their turbines, or the water plant from which the energy company gets their water supply. Those companies would have no visibility into the fact that an adversary has launched a campaign against this ecosystem of infrastructure unless there is a way for the indicators of that attack to be shared widely and quickly, ideally in real time. And this is what the government is trying to accomplish with automated indicator sharing. But within the taxi server, within this heartbeat of automated indicator sharing, there's a few things that happen that are really important. Now, the first of which is this graphic of a scissor and an XML. XML is another format. And you heard the prior panel talk about the privacy scrub here. And so again, not going to belabor that in great depth. But it's important to note that there are two tiers of privacy protections in automated indicator sharing. The first of which is from the submitting entity, which is required to validate that there is no sensitive information unrelated to the cybersecurity threat. And the second scrub is by DHS. And again, that is done mostly by automated means, by human review, when a computer cannot conclusively validate the lack of privacy-sensitive data in that field. More importantly is this magnifying glass, because what the magnifying glass represents is the idea of enrichment. Because automated indicator sharing is not merely a pass-through. It's not simply a pipe that shares indicators in real time from the private sector with government and vice versa, although that is an important role. But it's also a way in which DHS can operate this mixing bowl to help all participants understand which indicators are important, where are adversaries launching campaigns, and help us all dedicate our cybersecurity resources in a more focused, prioritized manner. So let's go back to our example a moment ago, where we have an adversary launching an attack on an energy company and the broader energy sector and water plants and manufacturing facilities in the energy company's supply chain. If DHS begins receiving a number of the same indicators from energy firms in the same sector, or from firms in disparate sectors but the same geographic region, because even though indicators are anonymized, they indicate sector and general geolocation, DHS will use that information, working with our partners in the FBI and other agencies, to actually increase our confidence and in the future our risk scoring of that indicator. So this is a hugely powerful tool. Because right now, one of our biggest problems in cybersecurity is too much data. Companies have data from sources they're buying, from their own network monitoring, from the government, and put very simply, our cybersecurity workforce often is overwhelmed by saying, what do I do with this data? What do I care about next? If the US government can tell companies, if you are in the energy sector, you really want to care about this specific indicator because it is targeting firms very much like yours, or it is targeting firms directly in your supply chain, that is a hugely valuable tool that will let companies both address the most important cybersecurity threats, hopefully block the attacks before they happen, and also let our cybersecurity workforce focus on the really big problems, focus on the adversaries that we know are not using known indicators, focusing on securing our broader network architecture. So pulling back a moment to this broader graphic. The goal of automated indicator sharing is not to solve the cybersecurity problem. That is a problem that is potentially unsolvable and certainly is not going to be solved by a single tool. It will require the full resources and levers of government and the private sector. The goal of automated indicator sharing, rather, is to ensure that we can address in real time the noise of cybersecurity threats. How can we address the 90x% of adversaries who are going to reuse their infrastructure, reuse their malicious software? And how can we ensure that if an adversary uses a given computer, a given spear phishing email, a given piece of malware, they can use that once. Hopefully, the original target will block it, but after they use it once, they can never use it again. That will do two things for us. First of all, that will really increase the cost of our adversaries. And as Don's first slide showed, there are many adversaries who are in fact deterrable if you increase their cost to a certain point. Not all adversaries, potentially, but certainly some. But the second piece, again, is that will then let our cybersecurity workforce, the cyber ninjas that are so in demand in this economy, focus on the most insidious threats, focus on the adaptable adversaries who are constantly trying to focus on single targets and find their way in. And if we can reframe the cybersecurity problem to focus on that top N% of cybersecurity threats and stop worrying about the 98% of threats that we can actually detect and block at machine speed in real time, we will have taken a significant bite out of the overall cybersecurity problem and made our nation more secure. And I close by noting that automated indicator sharing is a deep partnership within the US government. Don's up here today. We've seen DOJ on panels earlier, as well as other agencies. And the US government really is all in for this approach. And our goal is to decrease or eliminate any disincentives and build up incentives to ensure that companies, organizations, agencies understand the value proposition of this system, and the best way of doing that is for us to show operational value in driving down threats and letting us refocus on only the worst adversaries. Thank you so much and look forward to your questions.
So one thing that was asked is if we get into question and answers here, we do have some microphones, I think, available around the room. We want to make sure that we hand those to you first or that we repeat your question competently for the webcast that's taking place. Otherwise, they won't hear what we're talking about. And as we get ready for questions, the points that Eric made are just very critical to understand that we're talking about an economist approach to handling crime and adversaries, and that is increasing their cost while at the same time providing that deterrent effect. So AIS is not designed to be the sole or only government way for sharing information. We want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable contacting the governments, particularly the FBI or any other group that's investigating at your state and local levels. Make those contacts right away. As attorneys in particular, you have that ability to influence decisions inside whatever firm or sector you're working with in order to understand that there is real value in sharing information and to coming forward quickly. And a point I want to make about that is that when you come to the government, come to the FBI, we treat you like we do any other victim. It's not something that we stand up, or nor does DHS, and trumpet the fact that there is a problem in the network at the time. And that's something that we have to really get through, because there's often a lot of hand-wringing and understanding while the adversary is still in that very left space. As you start to see it move through the network, and many cycles are run where that allows the adversary to become more and more embedded in the network while decisions are made about how should we respond to this. Third-party mitigation firms are great. We encourage and we work with all types of third-party mitigation firms. But when it gets to that concept that Eric describes about sharing those indicators, those signatures, understanding how the attack's occurring so that it doesn't impact other people or the supply chain risk alone, as discussed, extremely important. So let's really start to think about it in terms of that. The more rapidly we can do this, the more effective we can be as a whole in reducing that repetitive attack structure. So let's open up for some questions here.
Thanks. How does cloud computing affect the process? Obviously, not on premises, not your own network or system. How is that changing or modifying how you're going to have to approach this?
Yeah, so I think how a participant in automated indicator sharing chooses to share information back to the government is really up to them. So in that model, it could be the case, for example, that a company who contracts with a cloud provider that company could host their own taxi client server and ask the cloud provider to just share back with them these STIX formatted indicators, which that company could then share back with DHS. It is also not implausible to think that the company would contractually ask their cloud provider to share information with DHS as well. So we are agnostic as to the manner and mechanism with which companies share indicators with DHS, if that is directly or through a provider or contractor. But the important thing is that adversary activity looking to attack their data is shared back with DHS.
And if you think about the cloud strategy, generally it's an outsourcing strategy, and it's designed to reduce costs of in-house IT information. So that includes a whole suite of products, different platforms, as well as outsourcing security of those products. So the goal of this strategy would be to also inform that whatever cloud provider that is, through this automated indicator sharing, they have their own defense teams working to protect your data. That should be part of the due diligence process, of course, to understand what you're purchasing in a cloud provider. But we strongly agree with that methodology, that if you're going to outsource, great, make sure that you're outsourcing your security as well and that you're as secure as possible. And that can be a very solid strategy. This can only enhance that.
And that's a great point. And I would build on that to note that certainly we are hoping that participation in automated indicator sharing will increasingly become a market differentiator for cybersecurity firms. And firms will actually, we just saw this a few weeks ago with one firm, Anomaly, that it was the first company to actually do bilateral sharing and kind of made a media event of it, because it is a big deal for these companies. And certainly we are hoping that this will actually be a marketing tool for companies to demonstrate their collaboration with the government.
So to the extent that either private information or confidential business information needs to be disclosed, where and how is that information stored? And how is access controlled?
So certainly information that is marked by the submitting entity as proprietary or otherwise controlled will be shared according to those markings. It will be stored on premises on the DHS platform. It is robustly secured in accordance with the security guidance for the program. And again, it will only be used and shared in accordance with the handling guidance and tagging from the submitted entity.
Not only that, but I think it's worth mentioning that data is scrubbed by DHS as well too. So I would almost call it a triple check right now. Again, we're in the beta phase, but as I look at the engineering and as I look at the schematics behind things, I look at it with a different eye, because I have to apply with basically very, very stringent constitutional standards for looking at any indicators that we receive. And I see at least 3 fail-safes to ensure that any PII or health information or anything else that it would be inadvertently transferred is still going to be scrubbed. And that's very important to understand. Now, let's say there still is something part of a signature or some analytics that needs to be run that reveals that. That doesn't mean that it's disclosed somehow, particularly from our handling. We handle everything under the Privacy Act, and again, that's victim information. It's not something that's public.
Seeing no more, thank you all so much and have a great day.
All right, thank you.